So it's time to talk about feminism. What are the issues that feminists have highlighted? Just to name a few: questions involving marriage, divorce, education, alcoholism. Many people forget that prohibition was often a religiously inspired proto-feminist movement where wives were often concerned about the level of alcohol consumption of their husbands and some of the consequences that had for their families and children. Rape and assault, of course, workplace discrimination, as well as objectification, that is to say, treating women as if they were objects, as if they were consumable, perhaps disposable and tradable, and, of course, pornography. So, let me ask you this. What is feminism? I want to suggest that whatever you just thought of is probably only an incomplete picture. In fact, there's not one feminism, but many feminisms. There's liberal feminism, radical feminism, the ethics of care, Marxist feminism, postmodern feminism, and probably many more besides. Now, all these views share at least some commonalities. Women have been historically disempowered or discriminated against, legally and socially. They also recognize that history, philosophy, and even language has been written by men and structured by men primarily for other men. They all see the difference between gender, which is socially constructed, and sex, which is more rooted in biology. They see the classic distinction between public and private as being inadequate. And they all agree, at least to some extent, that state impartiality, that is to say the government treating people equally, people of either gender equally, against an existing background of social and political inequality, is inadequate to remedy the situation. So, merely starting to treat people equal now is not going to solve the problem, the legacies of hundreds of years, thousands of years of sexism. So let's talk about all of these in sequence, starting with liberal feminism. Liberal feminism uses the vocabulary of prominent liberal political philosophers like John Stuart Mill and John Rawls to criticize patriarchy. And what they're doing is they're highlighting the lack of equality and liberty that women face and the hypocrisy and blind spots of male liberal theorists. Roughly, their view is to make liberal views live up to their ideals. Liberal views say that each individual ought to be equal, have a chance at developing themselves, at living a life of their own design and planning and authorship. And women, all too often, do not get these opportunities. So, in the 18th and 19th centuries, liberal feminists include Mary Wollstonecraft, who was the mother of Frankenstein author Mary Shelley, Caroline Norton, Florence Nightingale. All of these women emphasized formal equal rights to vote, to run for office, and access economic opportunities as far as their talents would take them. So, if anything, these early liberal feminists were the most likely to argue just for equal rights. Right? They thought that if women got the same treatment as men, then they could get as far as their talents would take them. Now, liberal feminists of the 20th century, like Susan Oken, whom you've read, and Carol Pateman, challenged the notion that formal equality, that's say legal equality between men and women, was going to be enough to give women truly equal opportunities. That is to say, the worth of women's liberties, how valuable a woman's liberties are constantly denigrated or harmed by patriarchal cultural practices, and especially the public-private line. So, for instance, if employers constantly believe that it is a woman's job to stay at home and raise children, they will be less likely to promote women, invest in developing the skills of women, because ultimately their expectation is that the women who are working for them will return and start families, and therefore that their investments in these women will be of a limited duration. Okay, so what about radical feminists? Now, radical feminists like Angela Dworkin and Catherine McKinnon are often associated with the women's liberation movement of the 1960s and 1970s. When you hear of women burning bras and otherwise saying very, very nasty things about men, often these are radical feminists. For radical feminists, the root of patriarchy is to be found in male sexual dominance within heterosexual relationships. In other words, heterosexuality, the way that it is culturally constructed in Western culture, and particularly Anglo-Saxon culture, is itself part of the problem. Our problems are cultural and psychological and have to do with how we understand heterosexuality. And so the root of political domination of men over women is to be found in ultimately cultural and psychological attitudes towards sexuality. Reform here either requires deprogramming men to make sex non-threatening to women, or in some cases, some authors argue that separation of the sexes entirely might be the better solution. For power to be distributed more equitably throughout society, for radical feminists, power has to be seized back at the interpersonal level. That is to say, at the level of individual relations between men and women, within families, within relationships, and all over society. So, radical feminists tend to view liberal feminist political solutions, equal opportunity, and perhaps in some cases affirmative action for women, as insufficient solutions, because these don't get to the root of the problem. The root of the problem is ultimately psychological and cultural, and unless you address those problems, then women will never truly be free. Now, another strand of feminism is often called the ethics of care, or sometimes maternal feminism, and unlike the first two that we have examined, maternal feminists tend to see women as, instead of being equal to men, as fundamentally different from men. So the idea is that the logic of equality is replaced by a logic of difference. So, for instance, the ethics of care says that men and women have different approaches to moral reasoning. Their experiences are different, and therefore so are their problem-solving approaches. So while other types of feminists tend to be universalists, they think that at some level, some sort of equality should obtain between the sexes, the ethics of care takes the differences between genders, as well as sexuality and race and ethnicity, very seriously. So, for political theory, the ethics of care really challenges the possibility of any such thing as a fair and neutral set of political principles to govern both men and women. We have to do the best we can, but at the end of the day, men and women are simply different, and the best we can do is to try as hard as we can to respect those differences and hold the choices that men and women make, if not of equal value, then certainly with respect. Another strand, and this is also an egalitarian strand of feminism, is called Marxist feminism. Now, Marxist feminism traces the domination of men by women back to the domination of the worker by the capitalist. How does this work? Well, the idea is simply this. The bourgeois family, by which Marxists mean the kind of traditional family that is male-dominated, where the man gets to ultimately tell his wife and his children what to do, they see this bourgeois family as a kind of necessary outlet for capitalism. That is to say, the worker who is oppressed every day in his job gets to come home and has somebody whom he can oppress. In other words, it's a kind of safety valve, if you think about it. And so the male worker exploits and dominates his wife and daughters because ultimately he himself is exploited by the economic system. So if you remove the exploitation of the economic system, then in large part you will remove the exploitation of women. But, of course, the bourgeois capitalist system entrenches this traditional family because it keeps the system stable and it gives the worker, the male worker, some form of control at the end of the day. So, once again, deep social problems are traced back to economic relationships, and for Marxists, as always, solving the economic relationships will help solve the other problems that those economic relationships cause. Okay. Final type of feminism that I want to look at is postmodern feminism. Now, postmodernism in general challenges this idea that we can accurately represent reality with language. In other words, our language is only meaningful relative to other language. That there is an underlying reality is not necessarily something that postmodernists doubt, but it is something that they think is always imperfectly represented by language. Now, so in other words, language shapes the very reality, or shapes our understanding of reality, shapes our perceptions, and of course, in the case of culture, in the case of oppression, in case of power, perception is 9/10 of the game. So for postmodern feminists, they want to look at the way in which language structures our experiences of gender, our experiences of domination and oppression, so gender, power, and all of our opportunities. So for liberal feminists, so for instance, a postmodern feminist will say, for example, that calling someone a policeman rather than a police officer already suggests to everyone that a police officer should be male, right? And so the postmodern feminists will try to get people to change the way they talk about police officers by calling them police officers rather than policemen. Similarly, for firemen becoming firefighters, and stewardesses becoming flight attendants. Again, the idea being that language structures the way we think about certain professions, and of course, it also shapes the way we think about the value of those professions. So, where liberal feminists locate oppression in political structures, Marxists feminists located in economic structures, radical feminists located in psychology and sex, and maternal feminists in culture, postmodern feminists locate oppression in the language we use to talk about politics and gender. Even the ease or difficulty with which we perceive and understand problems of gender is deeply affected by the vocabulary that we have to talk about it. In other words, for postmodern feminists, the words we use to describe gender and that we associate with masculinity and femininity are themselves problematic. Patriarchal societies may not even have the tools to even articulate what the problems are, because, again, in a patriarchal society, these sorts of questions will not be frequently addressed. And so the task for many postmodern feminists is actually to develop the tools so that we can even begin talking about the issues such that they may eventually be solved. So let's talk a little bit about Susan Mahler-Oken and the chapter you had to read for today. What are Oken's basic points in this chapter from her book, Justice, Gender, and the Family? 1. First point, many social problems have their roots in the family and how the state treats families. Second, traditional families do not protect women, despite their rhetoric in that direction. In many ways, traditional families make women more vulnerable to men, society, and the state. 3. Justice for Oken has to be applied to relations within the family if these problems are going to be addressed. In other words, you cannot keep saying that the family is this private area that politics should not touch, because at the end of the day, women are heavily disadvantaged in this private area. So, let's talk about each of these in turn. Many social problems have their roots in the family and how the state treats families. Well, For Oken, the family is where people learn their values. It's where they see their most basic role models on a day-to-day basis. Children learn how to behave by emulating their parents, and if their parents have unequal relationships, if their mother is dependent on their father, or if their mother stays at home and the father goes to work, then of course they will learn to think that this is normal and right, and will try to reproduce these relationships in their own lives. Second, traditional families don't protect women. In many ways, they make women more vulnerable. When women stay at home to care for children, they're not accumulating job experience relative to their male counterparts. They're not acquiring marketable skills because they're doing domestic work. And thus, ultimately, they're less able to function independently from men, unlike those men who are acquiring job skills that enable them precisely to become more independent from women, such that when a divorce occurs, the man can continue to earn a high salary, even if he has to part with some of it, whereas the woman often has to take very low-paying work because she has not been in the workforce for a while, or because she has not developed her skills to the same extent. So when women have less earning power and are still primarily responsible for caring children, they are also less able to leave. And so therefore they're more vulnerable to abuse within the relationship. So in that sense, the vulnerability of the man and the woman in a traditional marriage is asymmetric. It's not the same. Women are not able to leave, or have a much harder time leaving, because again, their situation is worse, particularly if it is expected that they will also have to care for a child. This structures the kinds of jobs that they can go take, right? So a job that has very little in the way of flexibility with respect to hours will make it impossible for a woman to drop off her child to school and then pick him up afterwards. The point is that the types of opportunities that a single mother can take advantage of are going to be relatively restrained to those professions where that's possible. And finally, when women are able to leave relationships in traditional marriages, they often become dependents on relatives and on the state. And so ultimately they just trade one form of economic dependence for another. In other words, marriage for many women, or at least the traditional gendered marriage, is a kind of dependency that creates a vulnerability and a cycle of vulnerability that is very hard to break. Finally, her third point is that justice must, at the end of the day, be applied to relations within the family if these problems are going to be addressed. So families distribute important goods within society: resources, self-esteem, values, affection. Distributive justice is going to be therefore applicable within the family. Perhaps inequalities are permissible, but if inequalities are permissible, there's got to be a point to them. So like Rawls says, perhaps if the least well-off party within the relationship is as well off as he or she can be, then perhaps those inequalities are okay. And finally, the state has to interfere, if necessary, to help the more vulnerable. This means perhaps that employers would have to offer things like childcare or childcare subsidies. It could be encouragement of paternity leave to promote the expectation that men as well as women should take time off work to care for children. Perhaps state-funded childcare, as in Sweden and other countries, will enable women to enter the workforce and stay in the workforce after having a child, which will lessen their economic vulnerability within a marriage. State-funded childcare is another. Mandatory joint bank accounts is another option, whereby any income earned within the family gets dumped into a joint account, thus preventing a man from exercising exercising leverage because he controls money or sources and access of income. Again, all of these things for Oken are at least potential solutions that the state can offer to questions of distributive justice that arise as a result of unequal family situations. So, what kind of feminist is Oken, do you think, after having heard all of that? Hopefully you said liberal feminist. It's pretty clear that she wants to apply distributive justice and egalitarianism to the family. In other words, she sounds like she's trying to ultimately make liberals live up to the principles that they already espouse with respect to distributive justice, but highlight the ways in which families ultimately are also sources of or distribute important goods. What about Virginia Held in The Non-Contractualist Society, which I hope you've read? What is Held's essential claim? Her claim is that ultimately our political theories reflect the mental attitudes and models of men. That is to say, contracts between mutually disinterested parties, not close relationships between caring and mutually invested persons. The project for her is to see what society might look like if we flip the script and try to balance things out from there. That is to say, what would happen if we conceived the society as a series of relations between caring and mutually invested persons. Now, she draws the contrast between two different ideal types of relationship, contracting and what she calls mothering. So, for Held, men and women approach moral reasoning in very different ways. How is this? Well, men look at morality, for Held, as a rational and contractual affair, whereas women see morality as emotional and interdependent. For men, rational social contractors are conceived of as mutually disinterested, and these persons that are to be regulated by the state are assumed to be self-interested maximizers for the most part. Of course, from Held's perspective, mothers don't usually exhibit this characteristic with their children. They are not mutually disinterested contractors with their children. Instead, they tend to exhibit compassion and altruism. And this is not a weak motivator. That is to say, often people say, well, self-interest is the only way you're going to get people motivated to do difficult things or to undertake personal sacrifices. If you don't reward them or you don't punish them, how else are you going to get them to do anything? But it's worth noting that mothers freely do many things for their children out of compassion and altruism, and they work very, very hard at it as a result. And so money is not the only thing capable of motivating people to do things for others. And of course, for Held, this really seriously challenges the assumptions of most political theorists and theorizers. So, Held has this notion of the mothering person, right? The mothering person, for her, is about as gender neutral as the economic man, which she takes to be the subject of most political theorizing. The economic man, the reason he's economic is because, of course, he's a rational, self-interested maximizer, which is often the assumption that economists make about people behaving in markets, or how people behave in markets. So, it's possible, but, of course, just like women can be mutually disinterested contractors in the marketplace, men can engage in mothering relations. But then again, it's not clear why Held thinks that contracting is unfeminine. Is it the contracting itself? Is it voluntary contracting? Or is it the emotional distance? Is it the consent? Is it legal formalism? Rationality, egoism? Again, much to think about here. But again, she's trying to provide us a counterpoint, and hopes that by providing the counterpoint can show us how gendered political theory really is. So what are these essential characteristics of human mothering for Virginia Held? Well, for Held, a mother develops empathy and moral concern for others. A key role of being a mother is to teach responsibility and autonomy, as they try to prepare people to be responsible adults, and as well as trying to create and orient and socialize a person into a social order. Mothering is not natural, it's an act of creation, and it's completely socially constructed. So if we're to contrast the motivations of rational economic man and motherers, what's the difference? Well, for one, consent and choice don't define the relationship between a mother and a child. The relationship of mother-child is not disposable or replaceable, unlike parties to a contract who are ultimately interchangeable. That is to say, you can go buy stuff at whatever store you want, Walmart, Target. Ultimately, these are all sort of replaceable relationships for you. If one store closes down, no big deal, but of course, losing a mother is a big deal, losing a child is a big deal. Interestingly, equality is not the primary value in the mothering relationship. Whereas, so there is a hierarchical relationship built into the parent-child relation. Laissez-faire is often not an option in the mothering relationship. That is to say, letting the child do whatever he or she wants is not an option. What counts as a self is interdependent. That is to say, our interests within the family are often interdependent. We conceive of our good as tied in to the good of others whom we care about, and so we're not mutually disinterested in the way economic man is. And finally, we're mutually vulnerable. Again, not equal, but mutually vulnerable. So again, this is sort of a very different kind of relationship envisaged by Held. So, just like we did with Oken, if you had to place Held in one of these categories that we just discussed, where would you put her? Hopefully, you put her in the ethics of care. Again, the idea here is that men and women are different. Their mental models, their ways of thinking about morality are different. Women think primarily of nurturing and mothering and interdependence for Held, and men think primarily of rational, disinterested contracting. Some implications for thinking about politics. So how do we make sense of Held? Well, first of all, maybe we don't always have to assume the worst of individuals. That is to say, politics tends to assume that if not restrained, if not checked and balanced in some ways, people exercising power will do it poorly. But of course, if that were the case, then we would never allow children to be raised by their parents, because children are ultimately at the mercy of their parents, and that relationship would be disastrous. But of course, that's not the case, or at least not always the case. And so maybe we don't always have to assume the worst about people. Maybe people are capable of altruism and empathy and caring, and that these are traits that are worth developing. Maybe also equality is overrated at times. It's not always about equality. In some cases, it's about mentoring, it's about nurturing. Finally, most of the time, well, not finally, but moreover, most of the time, our involvement with one another is non-consensual. The mothering relationship makes that explicit. You don't choose your parents, and you don't choose your children. The relations that you have with members of your family are very much non-consensual in that sense. You get what you get, and you have to deal with it. And that's often, if anything, a much better description of what it's like to be thrust into political society. You don't get to choose the people that you're in society with. They don't get to choose who you are, and so at the end of the day, you've got to make the best of it. And so viewing things as a social contract in some ways is perhaps less useful than as something entirely non-voluntary. Moreover, thinking of other people as resources for you is not going to be the way that you think about things in a mothering relationship. Other people are worthy of concern, and they're not replaceable. People are not interchangeable. They're not means for your ends. They are worthy of concern. And finally, we're ever changing. We're not born into this world rational and autonomous. We have to develop, and we're continually developing. Even as adults, we continue to develop. We are people capable of growth and change and transformations, both good and bad. And so, at the end of the day, thinking about citizens and thinking about politics as populated by people who ultimately have preferences that don't change and preferences that are static is probably a bad idea. And finally, we're both moral agents and patients. That is to say, we're both objects of concern as well as capable of acting. So agents, we act. As patients, we are acted upon us. We're both. And for classical political theory, primarily where people are looked at as agents. They're actors. Yeah, they're not seen so much as objects of care. And again, these are sort of some of the main differences between Held's view of politics and Held's view of how gendered our political theory ultimately is. Everything that we've been reading, basically from Socrates onwards for Held, is in some ways only looking at half the picture. Now, there's some mysteries here. If men and women have different models of moral development, is this something biologically natural, or is this something that's socially constructed by our societies? Again, Held doesn't really tell us this, but if it's biological, then this is pretty much inevitable. If it's socially constructed, then it's less clear what we should make of Held's insights. And does it matter? I don't know. And of course, we could ask ourselves how Oken and Held differ on how they conceive of what's wrong with the way the state treats women. Again, here, I have no hard and fast answers for you, but it's worth noting that what's wrong for Held has much more to do with the fact that something particularly feminine is being ignored, or the feminine perspective on morality and moral relations is being ignored, and indeed, if we took advantage of it more, we could more easily solve some of our political problems. If we, for instance, stop thinking of each other as disinterested, sort of moral, disinterested contractors who, could only engage in relations with one another, moral relations with one another, on a voluntary basis. But if we see each other as interdependent, as mutually caring, as at least capable of compassion and capable of sacrifice, then perhaps we could approach certain kinds of problems, like, say, nuclear disarmament, like global warming, like all kinds of activities that require a fair amount of cooperation in a very different manner. In any event, I'll leave you to think about these things. It's been 30 minutes. I apologize for taking up so much of your time. And as always, if you have questions, you know where to find me.